Just want to once again thank Rav Pearl for taking the time to speak with us once again this evening, the conclusion of our three-part series. I want to thank again our sponsors, Shani and Jorah Barber, Stephen and Neil Greenspan, Janet and Lior Hode, Michelle and Bensi Jaffe, Leora and Daniel Lowe, Jill and Dov Solomon, and Rochelle and Shlomo Yaros. And once again, thank Shlomo and Daniel Lowe, the chair of our adult education committee, for setting all this up. We again just really enjoyed so much learning from Rabbi Dr. Pearl. And without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that we have somebody who's annotating the screen accidentally here. So maybe, am I a co-host or did you just allow?
Let me see if I can do that. I can make you the host directly. I can't make us co-host at the same time.
Yeah, so make me the host.
Okay.
That.
You got it.
Okay, terrific. All right.
Do you want to switch it back just now so I can take care of like muting and stuff like that? Up to you.
Okay.
All good.
All right, we're good. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here again. I really appreciate those of you who have reached out to me in between our lectures with questions, comments. That's what makes this really so enjoyable. So it's great to be back here with Young Israel of Teaneck once again. And this is the third and final installment of our three-part series on the making of modern Judaism. When I gave these talks as part of a course on modern Jewish history back in a yeshiva university some years ago, I would often begin my lecture by asking my students the following question. I would ask them, if Rav Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? Or more specifically, just give me 1 second here. Seems like we're annotating again. Okay, good. If Rav Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? And then, since I was giving this lecture in Yeshiva University, I'd often specify just a bit further, and I'd say, well, to be more specific, if Rav Hirsch were alive today, which side of Washington Heights might we find him on? And we'd have it out there in class discussing whether, in fact, we would find Rav Hirsch here on the Breuer side of Washington Heights as part of the school that bears his name, that being Yeshivas Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, the shul known today as Breuer's, or would we find Rav Hirsch on the other side of Washington Heights, here at Yeshiva University, a school and institution that has as its motto Torah Umada, seemingly a derivative of Rav Hirsch's famous Torah Im Derech Eretz. Now, of course, I would make a point of noting that this question is not one that we as historians could ever answer. We always make a point of understanding historical figures in their historical context and never using a contemporary lens to try to determine who would they be were they alive today. But the question itself helps us to understand the fact and appreciate the fact that Rav Hirsch in the contemporary Orthodox world is a man whose legacy has been torn or taken into rather different directions. The community today known as Breuer's on one side of Washington Heights is a community that very much associates itself with the Aguda, strong connections to the yeshiva world, not necessarily a place that would consider itself to be modern Orthodox, let's say. Right? Whereas Yeshiva University, although we all know is a very diverse place and has all sorts of different people with different hashkafos in it, at its core, it is the flagship for modern Orthodoxy here in the United States. So which one is it, right? Did Rav Hirsch give birth to the Breuers community? Did he give birth to the Yeshiva University community? And indeed, if we look around, we can find the answer to this question as being, well, it depends who we ask. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in 2005, the David Dibor website published this piece that was that had been published in Yated Ne'eman, which are excerpts from Rav Volbe's take on Rav Hirsch, Rav Volbe being one of the great Musar masters of the 20th century. And in this piece published in Yated Ne'eman, aimed at a certain segment, right, of the Orthodox community, it was made very clear, you can see down here where it's underlined, that the view of the Gaon and Tzaddik, Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, concerning Torah im derech eretz was understood by the Gedolei Yisrael, whose pronouncements are our authority in life, to be solely a matter of Hora'as Shah. That is, Hora'as Shah, meaning a temporary injunction, something which was said at a given time because of very specific historical circumstances that were not intended to be true for all eternity. That is, this idea of Torah im derech eretz, that Torah should be combined with the study of culture and philosophy and literature and art, something which is associated with Rav Hirsch, was intended for one very particular given time, under one very particular set of circumstances, but is not something that ought to be continued through the generations, certainly not something, right, that should be continued in the form of Torah Umada. And for $22.39, you too can pick up your Art Scroll biography of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, right? And there you will learn, this is the description given of this particular text, that Rav Hirsch's great accomplishment was his ability to single-handedly arrested 50 years of unbroken ascendancy of reform in Germany, and that his philosophy of Torah im derech eretz is an insistence that the Torah continues to provide the guide to every aspect of life, even after the fall of the ghetto walls. A philosophy that sounds a lot like Torah without the derech eretz, right? It's a focus on the fact that Torah guides everything that we do, right? Which would seem rather different, right, than the motto of Torah Umada, which is at the heart of Yeshiva University and hence the heart of much of modern Orthodoxy today. But if we flip to the other side of Washington Heights, right, we will see that in fact, even going as far back, right, as 1950, if we had walked along along Bennett Avenue back in 1950, we might have seen, let's see if I can clear the red stuff. There we go. We might have seen this picture emerge on our walk. Let me just see if I can get it up. A fundraising banner that went up noting that this was going to be the site in which the Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch Yeshiva and the Breuers shul was going to go up. A banner which made it quite clear that part of what was going to be unique about this particular institution was its modernity. This was going to be a modern synagogue and a modern school. And in fact, when Rabbi Lamb wrote his book on Torah Umada, he notes at the very beginning that the role that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch played and his idea of the Torah Umada, of Torah im derech eretz, the role that it played was so extensive and consequential. It's so extensive and consequential in forming the ideas of Torah Umada that he gives it its own chapter, right? Whereas other modern precedents for Yeshiva University, he was going to briefly sketch in this chapter, he devotes an entire chapter to Rav Hirsch because he sees Rav Hirsch as that integrally involved in creating the antecedent for Yeshiva University. Elsewhere, Rabbi Lamb writes that the term Torah Umada is almost interchangeable with the term Torah im derech eretz. The first is Torah umada, he writes, the synthesis of Torah and worldly knowledge. For the latter term, Mada, we can just as well substitute the Hirschian derech eretz. They're the same thing. Torah umada, Torah im derech eretz, says Rabbi Lamb, one in the same. Rabbi Lamb arguing that indeed Rav Hirsch was the harbinger of what was to come in American modern Orthodoxy, the idea and the motto of Torah umada. Others in the world, the Aguda camp, claiming that no, what Rav Hirsch said when he said Torah umada was something very limited to a particular time and place in Germany, and indeed, right, the subsequent growth of the Breuers community, the German Orthodox community in New York, was one that took a rather different path. So, our question, right, is, which one of these two legacies is indeed more accurate, or perhaps to understand why is it that Rav Hirsch's legacy gets pulled in these two different directions, and ultimately, if in fact Rav Hirsch isn't or ought not to be considered the father of modern Orthodoxy today, who else might be considered to have played at least some role in the creation of what we know as modern Orthodoxy today? So for those of you who have been joining us for the past couple of weeks, it's not going to surprise you that this story takes place over the course of the middle of the 19th century, between these years 1818 and 1885. And as we've shown already, there's three different stories which intertangle and interweave over the course of this time. We've already covered the stories outlined here in the green. That's the story of the rise of reform. We've covered the story of the red. That is the response to reform by what will ultimately become known as the ultra-Orthodox community. And today our focus is going to be on the blue, the development of the Neo-Orthodox community, which will in turn pave the way for what today we know as modern Orthodoxy. It will also not surprise you at this point to learn that so much of this story actually centers around that same city in northern Germany that we've been talking about in each of the past 2 weeks, the city of Hamburg. Now, to understand, though, how this particular piece of the story develops, we need to take one step back to, let me first articulate, right, that it is also true that the story, our story today, also not only centers in Hamburg, but centers around the years 1817, 1818, 1819, and the immediate aftermath of the Hamburg Temple controversy. Right, the controversy that we've already seen twice now, this story of a group of young reform-minded Jews in Hamburg who want to follow the lead of other synagogues that have instituted aesthetic reforms in their shuls, but here in Hamburg, they wanted to take things a step further in creating their dignified and well-ordered ritual, and in doing so, they introduced three critical changes to the way in which shuls and shul services have been conducted. Number one, they were going to introduce not only a German sermon and a choral singing, but an accompaniment of an organ into the shul, again, played by a non-Jew. Number two, they were going to say some of their tefillos in German. And number three, as we've seen before, they were going to remove whole sections of the davening that referred to a return to the land of Israel, feeling that they would never get a full emancipation, full freedoms of the citizenship, right, in the German lands if they were to continue every day asking God to take them to a different country. We've seen already as well that this provoked a response from the Hamburg Beis Din, who then went out and encouraged the great Gedolim of Western and particularly of Central Europe to write tshuvos, showing why what this group in Hamburg was trying to do was actually against halacha, that these three things, that changes to the tefillah, or saying them in any language other than Hebrew, or introducing a musical instrument, are asur under any circumstances. And we showed last time how this sets in motion this story of the development of ultra-Orthodoxy, one which will come as these reform-minded Jews begin to move even to a more radical places with regard to their reforms, and as the students of the Chassam Sofer begin to be more radical in their response. But as we understand now our third story, or in order to understand our third story and how it too has its roots in Hamburg, as I said a moment ago, we need to take a step back and introduce ourselves to a figure who plays a seminal role in this. It's not a household name by any stretch of the imagination, largely because we know very, very little bit about him. He left us no writings. We don't even have a picture of him. We know very little about Rabbi Avraham Bing, except for the following critical pieces of information. Rabbi Avraham Bing was the Av Beis in the city of Würzburg in the early 19th century. And we know that Rav Avraham Bing, amongst other students, had 3 students who were going to play a leading role in what is to come in the development of Western European Orthodoxy. We also know that Rav Avraham Bing himself had a significant secular education, and that many of the rabbis who came to study, or future rabbis who came to study with him, also received a significant secular education, either at the University of Würzburg while they were studying Torah with him, with Rabbi Bing, or at some other point, right, either before or afterwards. The 3 students, right, who really play an outsized role in what is to come in the history of Western European Orthodoxy are men by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Bernays, or Chacham Isaac Bernays, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, and Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler. Now, Rabbi Adler will go to England and become the chief rabbi of the British Empire for pretty much half of the 19th century, but his story is not one that we are going to focus on today. Instead, we're going to focus on the stories of Chacham Isaac Bernays, or of Yaakov Ettlinger, and how they play into the unfolding of Neo-Orthodoxy in Western Europe. So we'll begin with Chacham Bernays. Chacham Bernays studies with Rabbi Avraham Bing in Würzburg, and then as a young man still, he is appointed to become the rabbi of the city of Hamburg in 1821. Now, let's already stop and just note what that means. Chacham Isaac Bernays, you might realize that the Chacham is not your typical title taken by Ashkenazi rabbis, and this was intentional. Chacham Bernays insisted that he be referred to by the Sephardic term Chacham, not because he was Sephardic, he was not, he was Ashkenazi, right? But because the title, he felt the title Chacham denoted a certain sense of dignity, a certain sense of elevation that didn't come or was not associated by German Jewry with the term rabbi. You can already tell by his dress, by the way he looks, by the title that he took, that although the Beis Din in Hamburg in the immediate aftermath or during the Hamburg Temple controversy responded by sending out a call for tshuvos throughout Western and Central Europe, the emergence of the type of response that we saw last time really is relegated to or happens within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When it comes to what happened in Hamburg itself, they took a very different approach. They didn't look to hire the Orthodox community did not look to hire as its next rabbi a student of the Chassam Sofer. Instead, they intentionally hired in 1821, only 2 years after this controversy had broken out. They now have a pulpit rabbi, their community rabbi position is open, and they intentionally hire a student of Rabbi Avraham Bing, a student who is university educated, who dresses with the aesthetics of a Western European rabbi, somebody who calls himself Chacham. In other words, it was an attempt by the Hamburg community to say, we're going to meet the reformers on their own terms. We're going to be able to do many of the things that they want to do, but do it in the context of orthodoxy, that is, without changing our tefillah, without adding davening in German, and certainly without adding an organ into the shul. So Chacham Bernays takes this position in 1821 in Hamburg. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger also studies with Rabbi Abraham Bing. After studying with Rabbi Bing, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger goes to the city of Mannheim, where he opens a yeshiva, or is known as a Klaus, a small yeshiva in the city of Mannheim. And after being there until 1836, he too comes not to Hamburg, but to Hamburg's sister city right across the river. So today, if you were to visit Hamburg, there is a section of Hamburg known as Altena Altstadt, or the old Altena. Altena, back in the times of Rabbi Ettlinger and Chacham Bernays, was actually technically in Denmark, whereas this was the border between the German lands and the Danish lands. But there was free passage between the two, right? And they were, as you can see, extremely close to one another. So by 1836, you had two students of Rabbi Bing in sister cities right across the river from one another, one being Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, the other being Chacham Bernays. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger is known today for his insights into the Gemara, his tshuvos. Right? He was a world-class Talmud Chacham, right? and still very much appreciated as such today. Chacham Bernays was known for something a little bit different. But before we get there, let's just take one moment to note the following. This is a description by Wolf Holdenheim of Chacham Bernays, right, who describes him in the following way. My friend, what you ask is difficult indeed. In order to properly assess Bernays, one must be Bernays. My limited judgment and meager knowledge do not suffice to measure his stature. He stands above and beyond our rabbis, masters of the written and oral Torah, above and beyond our philosophers and historians of antiquity. It is said appropriately concerning him, a wise charmer, the moment he begins to discourse on Torah or wisdom, all become charmed and silent. Hearing him discuss Hebrew language and biblical exegesis, one believes he is listening to Ibn Ezra himself. If the discussion is about Mishnah, Talmud, Sifra, Sifrei, it is as if he's become Maimonides incarnate. In general knowledge, he is Plato incarnate. Regarding his character, he is pious, noble, and modest. Any community, large or small, that will have the good fortune to come under Bernays' leadership will not long remain isolated. It will become an Ir va'im b'Yisrael, and all the nations shall flow to it. Now, Heinrich Heine is a interesting character born to a Jewish family, but ultimately, not ultimately, but at a very young age, he converts to Lutheranism and becomes one of the great German poets of the 19th century. He gives a similar account of Bernays, but perhaps not quite as complimentary, when he writes, he is an ingenious man and has more spirit within him than Dr. Clay, Solomon, Auerbach, the first and second. Those were the Reform rabbis, or Reformist rabbis in Hamburg at the time. Yet, he writes, none of the Jews understands it. So the picture that emerges of Chacham Bernays is one of a man of incredible scholarship, who has depth and profundity and articulates ideas that are considered to be lofty and elevated. The degree to which the Balabatim in Hamburg actually understood what it was he was saying, right, that remains to be seen. But what I did want to point out for a minute, though, is what happens next, right? In the next generation of Talmidim or Orthodox rabbis who emerge on the heels of the Chacham Bernays and Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, and not only on their heels, but actually in their vicinity or at their footsteps. So the first is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Hirsch, as you can see here, was actually born in Hamburg in 1808. Now, of course, that tells us a great deal about where Rav Hirsch comes from, right? And what the influences on him as a young man were. Rav Hirsch is 11 years old. Well, when the controversy starts, he is 9 years old, right? Old enough to hear and understand what is being discussed at his Shabbos table. Right? As members of the community undoubtedly are discussing over cholent, these new reformers who are trying to bring all these new kinds of changes into the shul. In fact, Rav Hirsch's grandfather, Rav Mendel of Frankfurter, was a critical member, a revered member of the Hamburg community, right? And it was very much a part of the discussions with these early reformers and trying to counter what it was they were doing. That not only was Rav Hirsch old enough to understand and hear and take in and be influenced by what was happening in Hamburg in the first or second decade of the 19th century, but when Rav Hirsch turns 13, when he is bar mitzvah, who is the rabbi in Hamburg? None other than Chacham Isaac Bernays. He takes his position in 1821 in time to preside over the bar mitzvah of the young Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. For the next couple of years, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch attends the shul of Chacham Isaac Bernays every single Shabbos. He hears the lofty ideas, the elevated notions that come across in his drasha. He has a role model of somebody who is university educated, who appreciates literature and philosophy and integrates it into the way in which he learns Torah. Well, the young Samson Raphael Hirsch will leave Hamburg for about a year, and he will go to study in yeshiva. Or Samson Raphael Hirsch only studies in yeshiva for 1 year. But it's a critical year because he goes to Mannheim, and there he studies with Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. So although Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch has left Hamburg before Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger has ever come to Altona, he studies with both Chacham Bernays and Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Ultimately, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch will take a series of smaller positions, smaller rabbinic positions, and then it will be his first real breakthrough position is when he becomes the rabbi of Nikolsburg and the chief rabbi of Moravia in the 1840s. From there, he will ultimately leave, right, and come to Frankfurt in 1850. And we'll come back to that story in just a minute. But it's critical to know that there is another young rabbi who is following a very similar trajectory in certain ways to that of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And here I refer to Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer. Rabbi Hildesheimer was born in the city of Halberstadt, right? But as a young man, he travels not to Hamburg, but to Altona to study with Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger once he has become the rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva in Altona. So you have Rabbi Hirsch, who is a young man in the shul of Rabbi Isaac Bernays, Chacham Isaac Bernays, who then leaves to study with Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. You have Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer, who comes to Altona to study with Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, and then he, as he notes, would come from time to time to go listen to the drashos of Chacham Isaac Bernays. So both young rabbis are influenced significantly by both of these students of Rabbi Bing, both Chacham Bernays and Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer's story goes like this. He learns for 3 years in Altona with Rabbi with Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. Ultimately, he will take his first rabbinic position in the city of Eisenstadt in 1851. Okay, and he will go from there to Berlin in 1869. So by the time we get to the second half of the 19th century, we have two outstanding rabbinic scholars, both of whom are students of both Chacham Bernays and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, who have taken positions in two significant cities in Germany, in Frankfurt and in Berlin. Now, I have circled for you here these two cities, these two stops along the way, right, for both Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Hildesheimer. Rav Hirsch in Nikolsburg and Rav Israel Hildesheimer is in Eisenstadt. And I'm wondering if anybody can figure out why those two stops are critical to this story. If we were doing this live, I would stop and wait for somebody to jump in. But I hope some of you can figure it out. If you remember our story from last time, right, we noted at the end of our lecture that the students of the Chassam Sofer, right, who begin to really make this move, for lack of a better term, to the right, right, who begin to really rally or circle the wagons, were actually not responding to the reform movement, because by the time you get to the 1850s and 1860s, the reform movement is doing all sorts of things. The early reform movement is doing all sorts of things, suggesting all sorts of things that were pretty far from what the students of the Chassam Sofer seemed to be getting worked up about. Remember, they were getting worked up about choirs, about dress, right, about having a chuppah inside of a shul instead of outside of a shul. Well, and ultimately we landed up at the end of our last lecture arguing that it wasn't the reform movement that early ultra-Orthodox community was responding to, but rather it was the Neo-Orthodox community that they were responding to. And here you see it geographically speaking, because both Rav Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer, who were Western modern rabbis in a sense, both of them students of Chacham Bernays and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, both take positions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you look at Eisenstadt, you can see that right behind Eisenstadt there is the larger city of Bratislava. Bratislava, we mentioned last time, is Pressburg. That is home to the Chassam Sofer, and then the Chassam Sofer's children and his students. And interestingly, neither of them land up being fully successful in Austro-Hungary. Neither Rav Hirsch nor Rav Hildesheimer really find or are able to withstand some of the pressures that come their way being in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and ultimately will make their homes back in the German lands. Now, when they come back to the German lands, and we'll start here already with Rav Hirsch, it's important to understand where they were coming back to, right, and what German Orthodoxy was like in the middle of the 19th century. And one way of illustrating that is simply to look at the pictures of the men that we're talking about. So these are three of the four rabbis that we're talking about here. On the left-hand side, this is Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. This in the middle is Chacham Isaac Bernays, and this on the right here you can see is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. So now I'm going to flip the screen for a second, and I'm going to show you three Protestant clergymen of the late 18th and early 19th century, as well as three prominent rabbis from about the same time, but from Eastern Europe. And you tell me, which group do our German rabbis resemble more? Is it your Protestant clergy here on the left? Or is it your Orthodox Eastern European rabbis here on your right? And you'll immediately notice the garb, the robe, the sash here at the neck, right, clearly reflects the Protestant clergy and the fashions of the time in Western Europe, and looks distinctly different than the rabbis from the very same time in Eastern Europe. Here they are again. And again, that's reflective of a critical piece and a critical point of fact in understanding who Rav Hirsch was and what Rav Hirsch was doing. And the point is as follows. This is the Orthodox rabbis of the time, meaning that even in the Orthodox communities of Western Europe by the 1830s already, modernity had very much set in. Remember, these rabbis, Rav Hirsch and Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer, are already third generation learning from rabbis who are already Western educated. As you can see here from his two teachers, are rabbis who are already Western dressed. This is a given that there are certain elements of Western society, Western culture that are going to be part of Jewish life, were things that were not questioned by the time you were in the late 1830s and the 1840s. And some of that is reflective in Rav Hirsch's writing. So Rav Hirsch's earliest publication were his 19 letters, which is a work that's written as in the voice of a young man from the time who is writing to a rabbi, asking him a series of questions, and the rabbi responds with the rabbi being Rav Hirsch, right, responds with lengthy answers. And you can hear just in the language of this young man that he writes, "Thus I have always wondered more than a little how you, who know how to appreciate the beauties of Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, and can fathom the logical edifices of Leibniz and Kant, can find pleasures in the formless, tasteless writings of the Old Testament, or in the illogical disputations of the Talmud." Note, this young Jew is not writing, "I'm wondering how an Orthodox Jew like you, who values Talmud and the Old Testament, can find, has permission to engage in the writings of Virgil and Tasso and Shakespeare, Leibniz and Kant." That wasn't the question. It was a given that he was conversant in Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, in Leibniz and Kant. The question is, why does he still think that Torah has some relevance, has some meaning in the 1830s, in the 1840s, in the German Jewish community? And a similar note can be found here in Rav Hirsch's later writing, when he describes the state of education amongst German Jews in the early 19th or in the 1830s and the 1840s. He writes, "And as for the religious training of the young, which should be the bearer of all our hopes for the future, how does it fare? What does it look like? Our religious schools," again, "our religious schools are like all the other institutions of learning of the present day. Our young are made thoroughly capable of contending vigorously in the struggle for a livelihood. The trades, commerce, the arts and sciences, all these are carefully inculcated and the mind developed. Although even in this regard, more attention is paid to the mere training of the memory than to the cultivation of habits of thought," still, by the way, a problem in our schools today. "But what about the education of the heart? The cultivation of Judaism? Where is the school that is imbued with the Jewish spirit, so that the spirit may also inspire the lives of its students? What about the rearings of human beings who will see themselves as creatures living in a divine world and endowed with powers belonging to God, which they are to dedicate to the fulfillment of God's will? Where are the young men and women who will rejoice in their mission and who will be imbued with fiery love for the name Jew, which summons them to such a way of life, to fulfill the divine law amidst perils, suffering, and privations, who comprehend the world, the past, the present, and themselves as cornerstones in the edifice of the future?" And by the way, if you are not familiar with the writings and the power of Rav Hirsch's writing, right, this is as good an example as it comes. And I'm told that to have listened to him in German, right, was that much more powerful. He is a master when it comes to writing. He's a master when it comes to oratory. But the point here being the following: the secular education of Jews in Germany was a given. It was a given even in the Jewish schools. That wasn't a chiddush of Rav Hirsch. Right? What was missing, according to Rav Hirsch, was the Judaism. Or, put into his terms, the derech eretz was already there. What was missing was the Torah. And this comes through as well in a letter that he writes to a friend of his in describing the purpose of his next work, Chorev, which is less read today, but it's certainly worth a read. It is a compendium of halacha, of various Jewish laws in which he gives the reasoning behind each of the laws. And here he describes the Judaism of his day in the following way. He says, among Jews, however, sorry about that, nothing is less well known than Judaism itself. I skip down to the next underlined line. As it is, however, I see an older generation in which Judaism has become an inherited mummy, a generation which shows veneration for Judaism. It is true, but a veneration without spirit. Some of that generation, therefore, see only tombstone inscriptions in Judaism, and thus despair of the eternal validity of the one thing that makes life worth living. On the other hand, I see a younger generation aglow with noble enthusiasm for Judaism, or rather for Jews. These young men do not know authentic Judaism, and what they believe they know of it, they consider as empty forms without meaning. To him, right, what he sees in Germany, this is already the 1830s, certainly when he comes back, right, from Nikolsburg to Germany, to Frankfurt in 1850, what he sees are young people, are older people whose Judaism has become mummified. Right? It's something they do out of rote because their parents did it and their parents before them did it, but there's no meaning, there's no spirit, there's no inspiration in what they do. And then he finds these young people who seem to be aglow with enthusiasm, but not enthusiasm for Judaism. They actually don't know anything about authentic Judaism, and what they think they know, they think is meaningless, right, in these emptyless forms. That is the world that Rav Hirsch is coming back to in the 1850s. And so when he writes that the motto of our congregation in Frankfurt is an excellent thing is Torah, is the study of Torah combined with the ways of the world, Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz, a phrase which I believe can also be found on a cornerstone of the Breuer Shul or the Yeshiva Shamson Raphael Hirsch. It is critical to recognize that rather than putting our post-World War II lens, right, from the perspective of Eastern Europe, where secular studies was not something, right, that was done in the yeshiva world, and understanding Talmud Torah im derech eretz, being the chiddush being derech eretz, so that now we can have day schools that include secular studies together with learning Gemara and Chumash. The reality for Rav Hirsch was that the secular studies were already there. It was a given, right, that Jews in Germany would engage in such things. The chiddush was trying to bring Torah back to these communities. For Rav Yisrael Hildesheimer, though, his story and the development of his life and his life work followed a slightly different path. And so let's take a minute then to sort of compare the two CVs of these two critical personalities in the development of 19th century German Orthodoxy. So let's fill in the story of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch just a little bit more, and then we'll come to the story of Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer. So as I've already said, if I were to encapsulate, right, sort of put that summary at the top of his CV for Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, I would call him, number one, a master orator. I'd call him a biblical exeget. He was a darshan, right? He was somebody who could make the Torah come alive, right, by bringing in words of Chazal, by bringing in his own creativity, his own passion for the arts. He was an essayist, he was a theologian, a deep thinker about Torah. He was not a classic Talmudist. He was not a classic halachist. We have a few of what we might call tshuvos from him, but they were not classic tshuvos like you would see coming out of Eastern Europe or by certain rabbanim even still today. As we've said already, he studied for 1 year under Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. He also spends only 1 year in university. So some have mistakenly referred back to Rav Hirsch as a rabbin or doctor. He was certainly not. He did not have a doctorate. He did not even complete any undergraduate studies. As I've noted, his first two positions he took in Oldenburg, then Emden. That's where he started publishing his works, the 19 letters of Ben Uziel, Chorev, which if they were to belong to a genre today, we might say these were works of Kiruv. These were attempts to bring a generation that had already veered pretty far from traditional Judaism, or from a connection to traditional Judaism, an attempt to connect them again. When he is the rabbi in Nikolsburg, though, he takes on a very important fight for Austro-Hungarian Jewry, which will also lay the groundwork for what he is to do in Frankfurt as well, which also adds a whole nother dimension to the legacy of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. As the chief rabbi of Moravia, this was a political position as well. And Rabbi Hirsch, therefore, leads the fight to try and get full emancipation for Austro-Hungarian Jews in the mid-1840s. That meaning they should be treated with the same legal rights as all other citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ultimately, Austro-Hungarian Jewry is emancipated following the revolts of 1848, but it's not actually through the channels that Rav Hirsch had attempted, right, to first use. But it's critical to recognize that he was very much involved in the politics of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's also critical to recognize, as we mentioned before, that when Rav Hirsch attempts in his role as chief rabbi of Moravia, Moravia being in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to centralize practice in this community, and he becomes under fire both from the more reform-minded people to his left and from those students of the Chassam Sofer and others who didn't like his German introductions into the service, into his attempts to create a more dignified service on Shabbos, of introducing aesthetics into the shul choir, into the shul, and therefore he comes under great attack from the right as well, which explains why he left a position where he was the rabbi of some 60,000 people in the entire area of Moravia for a tiny community of about 100 in the town of Frankfurt. Now, I write here that this was a secessionist community. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that in the German lands, right, this is again not the Austro-Hungarian Empire now, back into the German lands, every religious congregation was under the control of a government official. Right? It was an official, you had to be officially sanctioned by the government to open a synagogue, to run a religious community of some sort. By the 1850s, in many towns in Germany, the people, the townspeople, the Jews of the town, were appointing rabbis who were of the more reform bent. By the 1840s, remember, there were already these reform conferences where these rabbis were getting together, creating a certain ideology that they all shared, creating, introducing some more significant reforms into their practice. Frankfurt was one such community. The community rabbi at that point was somebody who aligned himself with the Orthodox community, with the Reform community. And so you had a small group of traditional Jews who did not want to attend a shul that was run by a Reform rabbi, did not want their shechita, their mikvah, to be under the supervision of a Reform rabbi, and therefore broke away to create their own secessionist shul, a shul which was breaking away from the Jewish community, the Jewish community of Frankfurt. They did so, they got permission to open their own shul, and they called this shul Kahal Adas Yeshurun. They looked for a rabbi. Right? The truth of the matter is that the first rabbi that they went after turned them down, and actually, I believe went to England to become an Av Beis Din then. And their second choice was a man by the name of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, right, who knew that he would find a more welcome home, right, back in the German lands. And this community in Frankfurt also looked, were excited about the idea of bringing an Orthodox rabbi who at the same time very much understood and had integrated much of Western culture into the way in which he carried himself and in the which he practiced Judaism. Once he gets to Frankfurt in 1851, Rav Hirsch famously founds actually 3 different schools but probably best known for the vocational high school, the Real Schule that he founds in Hamburg. The community will grow by leaps and bounds over the course of the next several decades. He also founds and edits a journal called Yeshurun. We know that he writes a commentary on Chumash and Tehillim and the Siddur, which is still very much studied today. But perhaps what gets less attention is the political activity of Rabbi Hirsch. I noted a moment ago that this was a secessionist community, meaning the community itself was still run and governed by a reform-minded group and a reform-minded rabbi. When Rav Hirsch gets to Kahal Adas Yeshurun in Frankfurt, one of the earliest fights he takes up on the political, in the political realm is a fight for tax relief, meaning the Jews of this community were still obligated to pay taxes to the Jewish community. If you pay taxes to the Jewish community, the taxes of the Jewish community go to support the official Jewish institutions of the community. And so Rav Hirsch's community felt like they were being taxed twice. They needed to raise money for their own rabbi, their own shul, their own shechita, their own mikvah, right? But yet they also had to pay dues as a Jew of Frankfurt. You had to pay to the officially recognized community as well. And so Rav Hirsch takes up the fight to try and convince the authorities in Frankfurt that the Reform community was not their community. It was something different. In fact, it was almost a different religion than the one that his community was practicing, so that ultimately to convince them that they shouldn't have to pay taxes into the larger community because what they were doing was fundamentally different. This fight ultimately will morph into something a little different. It will morph into a fight for total secession from the Jewish community, the right of a shul to no longer belong to the Jewish community at all, which is a fight that Rav Hirsch will take up with some of his co-religionists in other religions, a fight which ultimately becomes one for religious freedom in Frankfurt and in the German lands as a whole, something which will actually be achieved by 1876, when congregations in the German lands will now be allowed to leave whatever community they want to, be whoever they want without having allegiance to any official religion. And when that happens, Rav Hirsch will enter on what will probably be his last major controversy of his life, in which he ardently argues that every Orthodox community has to do this. They have to officially sever ties with the official community if the official community has become Reform in nature. There were other Orthodox rabbis, Rav Bamberger, probably the best known of them, who argued that Judaism couldn't do this, shouldn't do this, that we needed to stay together in some sort of official capacity. But Rav Hirsch argues that no, what Judaism needs to survive is a complete and utter break from any relationship with the Reform movement. So this is at the core of Rav Hirsch then. It is a rabbi who was fighting to bring secularized Western modern Jews back into the fold of Torah. He was a community builder, master orator, and somebody very much involved in the political front, but ultimately involved in a political fight to separate Orthodox Judaism from the rest of the Jewish community. Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer, and I know we're short on time, so we'll try to go through this a little bit quickly. His take and his CV, although he comes from very similar roots to Rav Hirsch, was really rather different. He was much more of a Talmudist and a halachist. And at the same time, he actually engaged in academic Bible study, unlike the drushos of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. But yet at the same time, he became a Rosh Yeshiva, much more so than a community pulpit rabbi like Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Whereas Rav Hirsch studied only for 1 year with Rabbi Ettlinger, Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer studies for 3 years under Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, somebody who we noted, right? He is the author, by the way, I didn't mention, of the commentary on Shas, known as the Aruch Laner, right? Again, a great Talmud Chacham, and Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger picks up much of that on his own. He is the first of the modern rabbis of Western Europe who we know to have completed his academic degree first as an undergraduate degree in the University of Berlin, and then goes on to get a doctorate degree as well. In 1851, we noted he becomes the rabbi of Eisenstadt in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So again, if you can place yourself into the world of the Chassam Sofer, right, in Bratislava, in Pressburg at the time, where it's really now the students of the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer's passed away in 1839. But here comes this modern Western rabbi claiming to be Orthodox, right? Claiming to be one who carries on the tradition of halacha, but yet he's university educated, right? He speaks German. He is involved in academic Bible study, and here he is in our backyard, right? In Eisenstadt. There he founds an elementary and high school, which also has secular studies, limited but secular studies. But more importantly, he founds a yeshiva that requires secular education in order to get in, and includes the study of Tanakh and Hebrew, which had not been studied in yeshivos up until that point. Ultimately, like I said before, Rabbi Hildesheimer does not have success in Austro-Hungary. He gets tremendous opposition from the rabbinic establishment there. And it's particularly, this comes to a head in 1864, when the Austro-Hungarian government has a proposal to create a state-sponsored rabbinical seminary. They want to create their own seminary, which they would have some control over, that would produce German-speaking rabbis to then take positions throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rabbi Hildesheimer supports this proposal, and as you can imagine, the students of the Chassam Sofer, or now the students of the Chassam Sofer, want no part of it whatsoever, right? And ultimately, it is for this reason that the Rabbi Hildesheimer leaves the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and when the secessionist Orthodox community of Berlin breaks away in 1869, they choose Rabbi Hildesheimer to be the rabbi of their community, which was called Kahal Adas Yisrael. When he gets to Berlin, right, he will found and create the rabbinical seminary that he had talked about when he was in Eisenstadt, although now it is not being controlled by the German government, but it was going to be controlled by him and the Orthodox community of Berlin. But the idea was the same. Rabbi Hildesheimer felt strongly that if Judaism was going to survive in Western Europe, there needed to be German, Western-trained, modern rabbis who could go toe-to-toe with the reformers in terms of their secular knowledge, their focus on aesthetics, their impressiveness, the way in which they were dignified. If we were going to beat them, says Hildesheimer, we need to beat them at their own game. And so he founds a rabbinical seminary that will ultimately become known as the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. So if we fast forward now just a bit, right, and think about what happens to the students of each of these two luminaries of Western Europe, Rav Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer. So we know that Rav Hirsch and his community in Frankfurt is ultimately taken over by his son-in-law, Rav Shlomo Breuer. And then it is Rav Shlomo Breuer's son, Rabbi Yosef Breuer, who will take it over when Rav Shlomo Breuer dies in 1926. He will lead the community into the pre-war years in Germany, briefly trying to recreate the yeshiva in Italy, which does not survive, which does not succeed, comes back to Germany, and then ultimately makes his way to New York, right, in the late 1930s, right before the outbreak of World War II, hence the founding of the Breuer's community that we know today in Washington Heights. For Rabbi Hildesheimer, his seminary, his rabbinical seminary, does take off in Berlin. The next leader of that seminary is Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who is probably the great Western European posek of the early 20th century, as well as a great Tanakh scholar as well. And then he hands the reins over to Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who interestingly is an Eastern European Rav, somebody who brings the learning of Eastern Europe and combines it with the learning of Western Europe, right, at the helm of this seminary for training Western, new modern Western rabbis. And so it may not surprise you then that when Rabbi Rakefet wrote this piece on the early years of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, He wrote the following, that a contemporary thus described his memories of a frequent Berlin street scene during this period, that is the period of the 1830s, as follows. In those years, one could frequently encounter three men walking along the streets of Berlin who stood out even amongst Berlin's Jewry, which was certainly not short of eminent personalities. The three men were Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, with Professor Eugene Mitvach, an Orthodox Jew and a distinguished Orientalist, and with Rabbi Chaim Heller, one of the great scholars of his time, sometimes accompanied by Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, rector of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. The world of 20th century, the 1920s to the early 1930s, of German Orthodoxy in Berlin actually becomes the center from which the Torah Umada world of Yeshiva University will take its cues from the Hildesheimer Seminary, from Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who brings the learning of the East and combines it with learning of the West, right? To a large degree, it is Berlin, right, that becomes the early antecedent of a Yeshiva University type orthodoxy, rather than Frankfurt, which is very much the antecedent of the Breuer's community. So while it is true that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's writing of Torah im Derech Eretz does play a role, right? And I don't want to say that it doesn't. It does play a role in the formation of Torah Umada, right, and Yeshiva University. I think it is also quite accurate to draw the line more strongly to his grandson, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Breuer, because ultimately Rabbi Hirsch, as we said before, his focus was on Torah. The Derech Eretz was a given. His focus was creating a community around Torah, and one that actually would separate itself from other influences at his time, those being the influences of the Reform movement. Whereas the other side of Washington Heights might also be traced back to the influences of Rabbi Dr. Israel Hildesheimer, his creation of a seminary which was going to meet the reformers at their own game by training young people in secular studies, by making sure that rabbis were worldly and could hold their own, and introducing the aesthetics into what they do so that they would be seen as dignified upholders of traditional Judaism. And we know that there were influences from that rabbinical seminary on the young Rabbi Yosef B. Soloveitchik, which ultimately will bring us down to the modern Orthodoxy and Yeshiva University that we know today. Before I finish, let me recap as follows. We have now told the story of these three interweaving tales: the tale of Reform Judaism, right, and its early start with the Hamburg Temple controversy, the response of the Chassam Sofer and others with Eila Divrei Habrius taking orthodoxy in one direction, the response of Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer, of Samson Raphael Hirsch, who will take orthodoxy in a slightly different direction, all as responses to this initial impetus in the Hamburg Temple controversy. We didn't mention it, but it is here in this period when a group of Reform rabbis early Reform rabbis will determine that the changes that the Reform were making to Judaism were too extreme. And so they broke away from them, focusing instead on what is known as Wissenschaft der Judentum, the scientific study of Judaism, but ultimately a community that will see itself as more conservative than the Reform community, hence the birth of conservative Judaism. And so in this tale of 1818 to 1885 in Western Europe, we have the emergence of Reform Judaism, of conservative Judaism, of an ultra-Orthodox Judaism, of a Neo-Orthodox Judaism. But I don't want to make the mistake, right, that I think many historians make in describing this as the sum total of the story of modern Judaism, right? Because at the end of the day, this was the story of Western European Judaism, which does play a very critical role in defining American Judaism as we know it today. But it's critical to recognize that the German Jewish population in 1880 numbered about 500,000. Yet in Poland, there were 1 million Jews, and in Russia, there were 2.5 million Jews. Right? So there were many, many more Jews who were not part of this story at all. Right? Their stories will become influenced, particularly through the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by what's going on in Germany. But ultimately, their stories really deserve, right, being told on their own. And I hope that one day in the near future, Rabbi Krohn and Young Israel Teaneck will invite me back and we'll tell that story as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Gil Perl, so much. We will indeed, Mit Hashem, have you back.
Okay, let me
I have anything to say about it.
a few minutes for questions.
Sure.
Okay, so here we go. Did Rav Hirsch, how did Rav Hirsch feel about educating women and girls? So you may have noticed that in the quotes, and it's not the only one, that he absolutely included girls and women in his all his educational endeavors. The school, for one of the schools that he created, was a high school for girls. It was different than the school he created for boys. They didn't learn Gemara, but they did learn Judaic studies, and he did feel very strongly that both boys and girls needed to have both a modern and a Jewish education. I don't think both Rabbi Breuer's father and son could have been born in 1850. That is certainly true. Then I probably put one of the dates on there incorrectly. I appreciate your pointing that out. I will change that. How effective were the Neo-Orthodox in bringing in reform or unaffiliated Jews? So it's a good question. The Frankfurt was remarkably, Rav Hirsch was remarkably successful in his community. The community there will grow by leaps and bounds over the course of the next several decades. The Reform community becomes a shadow of what it was there in Frankfurt. It's clearly the Orthodox community that comes to dominate in Frankfurt itself. As my grandfather can tell you, as he grew up in the outskirts of Frankfurt, it also attracted some from neighboring communities who were attracted to what Rav Hirsch was doing and the institutions, particularly the school that Rav Hirsch had created. How significant, how successful they were beyond the actual confines of Frankfurt, that's a more challenging question to answer. And ultimately, I don't know how successful they were there. And even in Berlin, Rav Hildesheimer, the community around the seminary was obviously very strong. But ultimately, most of German Jewry will either become, completely secularized or follow in the footsteps of Reform Jewry by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century. So why does the modern Orthodox community know of Rav Hirsch but not Rav Hildesheimer? If the latter is the true father of modern Orthodoxy, why does Rav Hirsch get the better PR? Because they didn't take my class in YU. Obviously. No, it's a good question. I mean, the answer is because it's funny. Rabbi Lamb had very strong connections to the German Jewish community. He lived in Washington Heights on that side, and he did see a very strong affinity between Torah and Derech Eretz and Torah Umada. But historically speaking, I think that the roots really are found far more on the in Berlin than they are in Frankfurt. But now you've all heard it, so now we have to go out and change the PR a little bit. What was the Neo-Orthodox response to Zionism? Excellent question. Very, very complicated. Well, actually not so complicated, but a little bit counterintuitive. One of the things that Rav Hirsch will begin in his late years is to try and organize the other secessionist communities to come together and in some sort of larger organizations of Orthodox communities. His son-in-law, Rav Shlomo Breuer, will take this to even a greater degree. And his grandson, not Rabbi Yosef Breuer, but Rabbi Yitzchak Breuer, Rabbi Isaac Breuer, will become one of the architects of what is known today as the Aguda. The Aguda being Orthodox communities coming together, under a single banner to organize themselves really politically at the time. The need, though, for this in the early 20th century in Western Europe and in parts of Eastern Europe was far less an attempt to respond to the reform movement, but far more a response to the early Zionist movement, because the early Zionists had successfully organized themselves into a political structure in Western Europe at the time, with the state of Israel being, or a return to Israel being the banner under which they came together. For the Orthodox communities, this presented a real challenge. They wanted the banner for Jewish communities to be the banner of Torah, not the banner of a return to the land of Israel. And so the Aguda, which had at its fore several of the leaders of German Orthodoxy at the time, were very much engaged in this battle against the early Zionist movement, certainly were not supportive of it. You know, where Rav Hirsch himself would have fallen out, again, he was a little bit too early, right, to really have a say, but you know, there are people who try to argue that much of his thinking is diasporic in nature, and therefore perhaps he too would not have necessarily jumped on the Zionist bandwagon, but certainly his immediate successors in the community were actively engaged in countering the early Zionist movements. And lastly, what was happening in England during this period was there a reform movement in England, and what happened with the Orthodox movement? Okay, excellent question. No, there was not much of a reform movement at all in England. They did. There are pieces, and I don't claim to be an expert in early English Jewry, but even to this day, you'll know that there are pieces of English Orthodoxy that do have certain things in common with German Orthodoxy, right? There's a certain focus on the decorum. There's a certain focus on the dress, right, and the ritual in which traditional English Orthodox communities engage, and those can still be seen as outgrowths of the German roots, right, of Rabbi Adler, who ultimately comes again from this line of Rav Bing and saw himself as very much related to the communities of to the work of Rav Israel Hildesheim and Rav Hirsch, as does the long-standing history of English Orthodox rabbis who were also quite well educated, right, university educated, right down again into the 20th century. So to this day, Orthodox reform movement does not have much of a hold in England, and it was that way back there as well. Okay, we'll make this the last question because the time is late. How did reform leaders react to Rav Hirsch at the time? What did they write about him? So there was quite a bit of back and forth between Rav Hirsch and Rabbi Abraham Geiger. They actually knew each other from their time at the University of Bonn. They did correspond with one another, and the reformers, the reformers were very much focused on kind of either for a time it was justifying what they were doing. From thereafter, it was calling for a new epic, right? A new Judaism, a new type of Judaism, and so they would throw Rav Hirsch into the bucket of those who were stuck in a time in the past, right? Of those who refused to move forward, of those who were, maybe spoke about progress, right, but didn't actually believe in it, weren't willing to take the steps necessary to move Judaism forward. And so they didn't really see them as much of a threat, so much as they painted them as something which was, somewhat irrelevant to what it was that they were doing or trying to do as they moved forward. Okay, once again, I apologize for the lateness of the hour. I appreciate your taking the time out, especially those of you who have been with us now for all 3 weeks, and I look forward to spending time learning with you sometime soon again. Thank you, Rabbi Krohn. Thank you, Young Israel Teaneck.
Thank you again, Rabbi Perl. Again, just our Karsa Tov for taking 3 nights out of this month to really spend with us. We really appreciate it so much. And thank you again to everyone who joined us from our shul, from outside our shul. Really so great to have so many of you joining with us. A great turnout over the last few weeks. And we look forward to continuing to learn and grow together for a long time. Thanks so much, and wishing everybody a wonderful evening.